Today I'm going to talk about the question, what is consciousness? And just give some reflections on that question. I talked about in a previous video how the idea of consciousness as something that is personal, something that belongs to a person, or something that is an aspect of the individual, is just one idea of what consciousness is. I want to talk a little bit about this question itself this time. What is consciousness? This question often is assumed to be a spiritual kind of question, right? When we talk about consciousness, it's often assumed to be in a spiritual sense that we're talking about it. But of course, just as we mentioned, the very idea of consciousness is something extremely personal in our society. In other words, everybody has it, right? It's not that only people who consider themselves spiritual have consciousness. No, right? Consciousness is ubiquitous in humankind, in what we call living organisms. So when we're asking what is consciousness, this is not uniquely a spiritual question. In fact, in the last several years, in the last decade maybe, science has really started to take up this question of what is consciousness. It's a tough question to really get at, because let's say consciousness is something, right? Let's just say this fist is consciousness. We're just going to objectify it for a second, just to look at the nature of the challenge we're dealing with. So if this is consciousness, and then I want to know what is consciousness, right? I want to know what this is. Then of course I place my attention on it and I try to derive some kind of understanding of this based on however it is I perceive this, right? Whatever it is I perceive this to be. Now with consciousness, the challenge is that the thing I am using, the resource that I am applying to know what this is itself consciousness, right? There has to be consciousness present to begin with for me to know anything. And if I objectify consciousness in some way, like this is, the individual's consciousness, this is a plant's consciousness, right? Or this is an animal's consciousness. However I objectify it. Today there are many theories about consciousness. It's very popular now to start thinking about this question. So however I objectify it, whatever definition I use of consciousness, at the very least, it starts to become some kind of a concept or some kind of a thought. Whatever I say consciousness is, whatever anybody says consciousness is, right? If it's taken at the level of those words, if it's taken at the level of that idea, then at the very least it remains an idea, right? Maybe not a thing like this fist or this hand we can say is a thing apparently, and therefore we can say that this is maybe more dense or more palpable or more concrete or more understandable than an idea, which seems to be more subtle than what is apparently a physical thing. So in the case of consciousness, even when it's an idea, we're still objectifying it as an idea, right? So I would need consciousness, I would need some awareness or some ability to recognize or some fundamental potential for knowing to be applied in a particular way for me then to know consciousness as an idea or the hand as a thing. So this shows the challenge of understanding or recognizing or experiencing, whatever word we want to use, what consciousness is. It is very much like a dog chasing its tail, because we're saying consciousness is one thing and then we're using our own consciousness to chase it. But where is that consciousness coming from to begin with, right? I can keep chasing ideas of consciousness. I can keep chasing stories about consciousness. I can keep chasing experiences of what we call consciousness, right? Maybe a peak experience or a particular kind of experience or a particular kind of feeling that is associated with an expanded state. So in keeping on chasing these experiences, it is kind of like a dog that keeps chasing its tail, right? The idea is that the whole event, the chasing itself, is an expression of consciousness. And we'll get to that in just a second. So this question of what is consciousness is not, most fundamentally, it's not a spiritual question. It's not a philosophical question. It's not a scientific question, right? It's not a musical question. It's not a question of engineering. And yet it can be all of these. We can ask what consciousness is through the lens of science, right? Through the lens of philosophy, through the lens of music, right? Through any lens we can express what consciousness is. But fundamentally, consciousness, if anything, is simply practical. It is simply practical because it is based on that consciousness itself and how it expresses through us that we perceive ourselves, that we have an experience of what it is that we are, and we have an experience of what it is the world is. And this is something that is largely ignored in the world society today. Right? That it is through this consciousness, whatever it might be, it is through this consciousness that we experience ourselves, right? That we have a head, or that we have arms and legs and a torso and an abdomen, right? Or that what I am is encapsulated within the boundary of the skin, right? Or that what I am is not that. Or that this I, the thing we call I, has many layers to it, and sometimes includes a subject, but may also include the object that we're looking at, depending on how the I is cast, all through this prism of consciousness. And this is not spoken about enough, because if we speak about this, and if this is open knowledge, right, which is open in the sense that anybody can recognize this, but if this becomes part of the popular conversation, if this becomes something rather obvious, which again it is, but it's not talked about a lot, but if this becomes one of the common storylines, then what is consciousness at that point? It is simply practical, because we see that it filters up as any and all experience, right? And at that point, there's not one area of life which is called spiritual, and there's not another area of life which is called pop culture, and another area of life which is called science, right? The vision and the knowledge has become integrated enough, and it has taken deep enough root that it permeates any and all experience. So the question of what is consciousness has to be so broad. It has to be so big. It has to be so vast. We have to see it as such, with that kind of breadth and depth, that it encompasses absolutely everything. Because it does encompass absolutely everything. All right? So it is not for one area of life. And in fact, as long as it's imagined to be one area of life, then it doesn't open up as much as it could, right? It's still closeted in a way, right? As long as it is just the spiritual life, just the scientific life. I want to understand what consciousness is scientifically. Let me create all of these theories. Let me define it in a particular way. Let me approach it with an angle. Fantastic. It's important we do all that. And as long as that's the only way we're approaching it, there's going to be a facet of what we call consciousness that remains unseen. Right? Because it is a driving factor that can even give rise to any theory. So what is consciousness? If anything, the question itself is fundamentally supremely practical. Supremely practical. because it shifts how we see ourselves and see the world. So, what is a simple way to answer this question of what is consciousness? Right? And when I say answer, I don't mean a definitive answer, but a way to maybe start looking at it differently. One way to look at it is that consciousness is what this world is made of. And to appreciate this, it's important to step outside of the notion of consciousness as we generally think about it, right? As living inside the head, or living inside the chest, or living inside one of the chakras, or living inside a particular field, right? It's not particularized in any way. It's not bound in any way. But this kind of consciousness, this fundamental kind, we can say is that which the world and experience is made out of. After all, the only world we know is through experience, yes? The only world anybody has ever known is through experience. But the problem is when we say this, people start to imagine that it means that the world is in our heads, or consciousness is in our heads, and this is a fundamental misunderstanding. It is simply an aspect of consciousness that appears or feels as if it's localized anywhere within or near the body. Right? So the feeling isn't wrong, the feeling is simply incomplete. If it feels like it's near the body or within the body only, this is an incomplete feeling of what consciousness is. It's the tail end that then needs to be investigated to see where it leads. Yeah? So what is consciousness? It is fundamentally what this world and what all experience is made of. No different than in your last dream. Right? In your last dream, your body was made of your consciousness. Your friend's body in that dream, as well as your enemy's body in that dream, was made of consciousness. Right? The cinder block that you actually stubbed your toe on that hurt like crazy was made of consciousness. And in fact, the very grid of space and time in that dream was made of consciousness, because you might have traveled millions of miles in that dream. Maybe you went to the moon and back 10 times. But where is that distance when you wake up? All right? Maybe you traversed many decades in that dream, or at least many years. And where is that time when you wake up? So consciousness spans not only space and time, but our states of awareness, waking, dreaming, etc. What is consciousness? It is that which this is made of. It's not localized in the head. It is this, all around us, within, without, including the boundary that separates in and out. That boundary itself is a coagulated aspect of consciousness. Right? When attention is rested on that boundary also dissolves. This is a practical question, more than anything else, and a practical investigation. Right? There's no answer that can satisfy. The only answer we can say, in a sense, is the fruit of the investigation itself. What is consciousness?